All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the Synthesis webcast series. My name is Eric Kavanagh. I'll be your host for today's event, Fueling the Modern Data Warehouse. Let's dive right in, folks. Three presenters today, yours truly at the top. Our good friend Dewayne Washington, a.k.a. the BI Pharaoh, I love that name, of the Business of Intelligence. He's an analyst with Eckerson Group. And Taylor Brown, co-founder of Fivetran. We're all going to join the party today. Feel free to send questions by the Q&A or the webcast console or the chat window there. So let's just dive right in here. First of all, I'll say a bit about the Synthesis series. This is a collaboration of the Bloor Group and the Eckerson Group, or Inside Analysis, as I now refer to ourselves at the Bloor Group. That's our webinar housing station, if you will, marshalling area, and also lots of news and interesting stuff going on there. We came up with this whole idea to bring disparate points of view together and hash them out in live events. So we're going to talk today about fueling the modern data warehouse, what that all means and why you should care. And I start with a quote from good old Dr. Phil. I love this guy. He often says that things start for one reason and continue for another. Pretty insightful guy, Dr. Phil, and of course we see the same thing in the world of data warehousing, right? So extract, transform, load, that was the way you got things done for about 25 or 30 years or so. Of course, it's still out there everywhere. And I remember way back in 2006 timeframe or so, a company called Synopsys was one of the first I came across to tout ELT, extract, load, and then transform. So it's not a new idea, ELT. It's been around for a while, but it is crystallizing now, and there are a lot of reasons for that. And one of the reasons is because the number of data sources these days has absolutely exploded. We're going to talk about that on the webcast today. And let's face it, the T, that transform part, that's a pretty dicey component of the whole picture. If you're loading lots of data into a data warehouse, you want to make sure you're loading the data correctly. You want to make sure that you understand what you've done in that transformation, and you want to make sure that there is a lineage, an audit trail, if you will, such that if somebody comes along and joins the company, they can take a hard look at it and figure out what happened. Well, in the traditional world of ETL, that's a very, very difficult thing to do. I can tell you on one of our other shows, DM Radio, that I've been running now for 11 years, even a decade ago, I thought to myself, stop the madness. We've got to stop moving data around again and again and again and again because A, it's brittle, B, it's time-consuming, C, it's expensive, D, it's error-prone. And one of the big reasons, too, is there was no strategic way to really understand how all these overlapping ETL processes were affecting each other. You don't get that strategic view. You can't really figure out where there's redundancy. You can't figure out where you're truncating some set of data, overlapping with some other set of data. It's just not a very efficient way to get things done. And, of course, you go back and think, why did the data warehouse come into play in the first place, right? Well, it's because we couldn't query these operational systems, and we needed to find a way to solve that problem. And so for all sorts of different reasons, we came up with the concept of a data warehouse, but times have changed dramatically, and one of the big changes is this thing called the cloud. Many of you in the enterprise know that cloud computing was kind of a dirty word all the way up till a couple of years ago, and now, thanks in part to companies like Snowflake, thanks in part to Amazon with Redshift, you have this cloud-based data warehousing that is much more agile, much more nimble, and guess what? Not nearly as expensive. So things are starting to change, and meanwhile, analytics in general, the stuff we derive from data warehousing, is now getting baked into operations all throughout organizations. So it's not just a subset of people who get to benefit from analysis, it's really the organization at large. Now, I mentioned to you the fact that we have all these new data sources out there. I'm a marketing guy, so I focus on that part of the world, and this is the MarTech 5,000. It's actually closer to the MarTech 7,000 now, 6,520-something. These are all web-based marketing automation tools, nearly 7,000 of them. That's not insignificant. This is just a small subset of that whole landscape, community and reviews, bots and live chat, advocacy, loyalty and referrals, influencers. Like just in the influencers tab there, you've got about 45 or 50 different applications. Well, what does that mean? This is just for the marketing side of the house. That's not including operations. That's not including procurement, for example. It's not including supply chain. It's not including HR. All these other aspects of the business Guess what? There is an absolute diaspora right now. There's a Cambrian explosion of technologies, and they're helping people run their businesses. Well, what does that mean for the analyst? What does that mean for someone who wants to get that strategic view? What it means is there's a huge headache out there waiting if you want to do things the old way. How did we used to do things? Well, a lot of times in data warehousing environments, you would just hand code ETL. I don't need to buy Informatica. I don't need to buy Essential. I don't need to buy any of these other tools out there. I'll just do it myself. Well, that works okay for a while until the data starts increasing in volume and variety and so forth, and then things just break. And let me tell you, if you had a data warehouse that had only handwritten ETL scripts, that is an incredibly brittle environment. It's going to be basically impossible to upgrade unless you just shut it down and start all over again. So do it yourself. It's one of my favorite movies, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. None shall pass. This is just not going to happen. Each of those nearly 7,000 marketing automation vendors, not to mention all the others, let's say there's 20,000 across the spectrum, they all have their own production schedule, privacy policies, data models, their own philosophies, their own APIs. To try to do all that yourself, I just got to tell you, none shall pass. It's not going to happen. So what we need to do is we have to have a situation where someone does a lot of that work for us, and that's what we're going to find out about today. And I can tell you one of the cool things in our industry, in the whole business of business intelligence and analytics, is that there is so much attention paid on this space that there is a tremendous amount of innovation. And I always like to focus on the cliches. Necessity is the mother of invention. When something needs to happen, it's going to happen some way or other. And that's happening right now in terms of giving us a tool to manage these environments. So just this very morning, I was on the phone with Mike Ferguson of Intelligent Business Strategies, who's one of the smartest analysts I know, and he's also a consultant, so he goes down to real-world situations all the time. He was telling us about a situation in the UK with cloud computing. There was an event just recently where they had something like 30,000 delegates come to this cloud computing event. He couldn't believe how many people were out there. And he was talking to one of his clients about what they're doing. This is a big brick and mortar. It's actually a big bank, I think is what he said. And the guy who heads up one of the major parts of the IT department said, yeah, we're still an IT department, but we've just dropped the T. So he's saying they're just an information department now. They replaced the T with vendors, with third-party vendors, with cloud-based vendors, most of them. But what does that mean? It's very interesting. So technology, that's what T used to stand for. Now it really does stand for transform, just like ELT, right? Extract, load, transform. And that transformation is key. We call it digital transformation, one of the big trends these days. And I can tell you, if you don't jump on the bandwagon soon and start finding ways to transform your own organization, your own data processes, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. At least that's my experience. And with that, I want to introduce Dewayne Washington of Eckerson Group. Dewayne, I just handed the keys to you. Take it away.
Wonderful. Thanks, Eric. I always love to hear Eric talk, and I always get enlightened by a couple of vocabulary words I wasn't familiar with. I appreciate it. We want to jump right into this. So there are three things that you definitely need to be aware of if you're going to have a data warehouse that's going to survive in this next millennium. If you want to be able to be in the top percentile of data warehouses or business intelligence organizations, then you're going to have to be familiar with three things: people, processes, and products. And we're going to talk about these three things. But it's important to note that it's not just about the tool. We'll talk about the tool, but overlooking these other two things and just going straight to the product, it probably won't fare you too well. And so let's take a look at it. First, let's look at the people. And when we talk about the people, it's not just those individuals who are implementing the product. It's not just people on the IT side. We have to look at who wants it, who's asking for it, who's actually doing the work. That's the people from an IT perspective, or as Eric said, sometimes just from the I side, and then who's using it. You need to be able to answer all of these questions. And when I say answer these questions, you want to be able to answer very specifically. Who specifically is asking for this? When I say who specifically, not just say the finance department. Who in finance is asking for this? Who specifically is going to be on this project to be able to bring things to pass? And who's going to utilize it? Now, a lot of people may think, well, Dewayne, it's not really that important. You know, I don't have to be able to answer all of these questions. I'm going to give you a perfect example of why this is important. I remember one time I was leading a team, and an individual came to me, one of my team members, in our stand-up meetings and said, hey, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And I'm starting on this project today, and I think it'll be a great project. And I asked him, who's going to utilize that? He's like, I don't know. Well, who's asking for it? Well, I'm not totally sure, but I think I know. Well, do you know the person's name? Well, no, I don't know the person's name. I said, well, let's pause on that for a moment, and this afternoon, let's track that information down and go sit with this person. Long story short, we were able to sit with them and talk with them, and we found out in less than 5 minutes that what we were getting ready to build, not only did he not need it, wouldn't use it, and didn't want it, right? So we saved 6 months worth of developing the wrong thing just by knowing who's asking for it and who's going to use it on the background. Knowing who's going to use it also allows you to be able to test it very, very specifically. So that way you'll know, is this going to meet this person's need? Am I really going after the right thing, or am I missing the block here? Who can I go and talk to make sure that we're on the right track with this development? And once again, this may seem like a very, very simple thing or something that's overlooked. And a lot of times when things are very simple to do, they're also very simple to not do. And what you don't want to do is end up spending $1 million going in the wrong direction, building something for the next 6 months or so, and it's not going to meet the needs of the individual. Now, there's some pitfalls that we want to make sure that we're looking out for. The pitfalls here are not knowing who the customer is or who's asking for it, not understanding the why. This is very important. It's not only who's asking and what they're asking for, why are they asking for that? And we want to get to a very savvy way of querying the user to find out exactly why they're asking for this. You might find that the reason they're asking is totally different than what they're asking for. And for those BI professionals that are extremely astute, you'll be able to figure out very quick, yeah, they're not asking for the right thing. We've all been able to figure out that a lot of times when that user comes to you and asks you for X, Y, and Z, they really don't know what they're asking for. And so to help define that, understand the why and understanding the user savvy. You don't want to underestimate this either. Okay, you don't want to underestimate the user savvy these days. 20 years ago, we could do that easily. Right now, that's a very savvy user. These are people who could do their whole job from their cell phone. They're being inundated with apps to do all types of things on a daily basis. Let's not insult their intelligence by thinking that they cannot grasp a concept or can't get certain things done because it's too difficult. Also seen a situation where there was some technology that the IT team was saying was too hard to put in place, it takes too long and too much money, and literally had the business go around them and just implement it themselves in a matter of days. And so don't underestimate them. We talk about people. Now, moving from people on to processes. Now, first of all, we got to take a look at the fact that data is all over. Eric brought that out. We're all familiar with data, maybe in your data marts. It may be on spreadsheets or spread marts. It may be in your front-end OLTP systems. Could be in clouds or other data services that you're using. Data is all over the place. You have your structured data. You have your unstructured data that's coming in from Twitter and Facebook and other types of social media, LinkedIn, all types of things that you're bringing in, maybe weather that you're bringing in. And so now we're inundated with this huge amount of data. It's everywhere, and it may not even be connected, right? And that's when you come into what your data warehouse is supposed to be. How do we make sense of all of this? If you're going to engineer for the future, you're going to have to remember a few things. First of all, you don't need to bring it all in. You don't need to ETL 100% of the data that you're dealing with. You don't need to bring in every tweet. You don't need to bring in every Facebook post. You may have a cloud service, a third-party cloud service that you're utilizing from a back-end database perspective. It is not necessarily the golden rule that you have to bring it in. That understanding that will help you with modeling and get some of your reporting up and going quicker, because you may not need to ETL that information. I say may not, because of what we're going to look at in just a moment. From a conformed dimension perspective, just for the sake of those that may not be familiar with the concept, if you have a system that is dealing with, let's just say you're at an airport, and you have one system that deals with your concessionaires, that may bill those concessionaires. You have another one that may actually keep track of the compliance associated with the concessionaire. You may have another system that is associated with mystery shops with the concessionaires. And you may have a fourth one that is customer-facing that tells you how to get to that particular store and concessionaire. Well, all four of those are keeping information such as the name of the concessionaire, as well as things like the terminal, where it's located. And it may be listed differently in each one of those systems. Being able to have one set of information data tables to say that when I'm looking for this particular concessionaire, it can look across all of these different systems and be able to point me toward them no matter what it was spelled like in the front-end system. So making sure to get your conformed dimensions in place. The great thing for me, and the most exciting thing for me over the past 20 years has been the cloud implementations. Now you can actually have your data warehouse born in the cloud. Like, you could actually skip a lot of the hardware issues. You can skip a lot of the capital expense when it comes to buying servers and all different types of software and looking at 6, 7, 8, 9 months to be able to get up and running for your implementation or co-locating servers. You can skip that whole entire piece and just be born in the cloud. And we're going to talk about in just a moment what you want to stay away from, but I do want to mention the fact that if you do have 22 servers that are there, don't ignore the fact that you can reproduce that in the cloud just because you've already purchased the 22 servers and you want to make the best use of it. Ask yourself the question, if I was starting today, would I do it like I'm doing it now? And if the answer is no, you may want to make some changes. And you also want to look at being agile. As much as we've been talking about agile, as long as agile has been around, and as much as we're all familiar with it, I still see a lot of companies that are familiar with agile. They can spell it. They know all the tenets of it. However, they're not implementing the agile methodology in their data warehouse. I actually heard a BI professional say, you know what, agile just doesn't work for business intelligence. And I'm kind of blown away by that statement. What else could you possibly be using? I mean, waterfall is not a better solution for them. And a lot of times it's just people don't understand how to implement agile properly. But you want to definitely make sure you're utilizing an iterative process when it comes to your data warehousing. And if you're using anything else, you're probably wasting a lot of time. And so if you want to make sure you're catapulting yourself into the future, you definitely want to look at changing that mentality. With that being said, let's take a look at a few of the pitfalls. I do want to mention one thing about processes. That's having the right data at the right time in the best way to the right people. If you want to make sure your BI implementation is poised for the future, you can ask yourself that question. Do we have the right information? Are we getting it timely? Is this the best format we can put it in? And are we getting it to the right people? You always want to be asking yourself those questions. And if you can say yes to all four of those questions, then you're in a very, very good place. But if your CEO has to go hunting for information and has to make 14 phone calls, well, that means that the right data is not getting to the right person at the right time in the best way. Because the best way and best use of his time is not to have him email and call people all over the place to be able to get his information. He should be able just to look on his cell phone and know exactly how to run his business. So make sure you're getting the right data to the right people in the right place, all right? So let's talk about a few pitfalls. Just because all these tools exist, don't get sloppy and lazy on your modeling. My good friend Tim Tim Hall says something all the time. You got to model it all. Model it all. Making sure you're putting your due diligence toward knowing where this data came from and understanding this data. There are a lot of powerful tools out there that you can just point the tool towards the data warehouse and it does all the work for you, and that's great. But don't forego getting to know that information and getting to know that data and modeling properly. There is no substitute for proper modeling. So even with all the great and powerful tools that we have in place, don't forego the modeling. Also, don't try to boil the ocean. Don't try to do every single thing just because now you have all these powerful tools. Now we can be born in the cloud. It doesn't really cost me a lot to move the information there. You still need to be very focused in your delivery. Even though over time you can build a delivery that has 60 or 70 different data sources inside of one data warehouse, there's nothing wrong with that. But don't start there. You know, start very, very small with one, maybe two sources. We talked about this during the pre-show, but this is important too. Do not overcomplicate your implementation. Just because you can do it doesn't mean that you should do it. Do not overcomplicate it, especially now. I mean, it is so simple to put certain things together, to connect data from one place to another. Let's not overcomplicate it so that it takes a long time to make changes or make some people almost irreplaceable. And while that may seem like a good thing, now what's happening is that when people seem to be irreplaceable because the system is so hard or so archaic or it takes so much to build, the business, remember, very savvy, much more savvy than we give them credit for sometimes, they have started just replacing IT. So if we can't get this system upgraded, we'll replace the entire organization that put it in place to begin with. So don't overcomplicate your situations. Now, we talk a lot about big data all the time, and data is big, and it's getting bigger every single day. But answers are not. Answers are small. It's not about big data. It's about getting answers to small questions. Never forget that. Don't lose track of the fact that just because your data is big, just because you're moving petabytes, doesn't mean that you don't have to answer that simplistic answer. If I go to the airport, the airport systems may have a ton of data. They may get data on every single airplane that's ever been to the airport and everyone that's on the way and updating every second and what type of airplane it is and how many people are on that airplane and what time it's going to touch down or what time it touched down 5 years ago. I don't care about all that information. All I care about is my plane on time? And what gate is it? Like, that's all I care about. I have a very specific question. I need a very specific answer. So make sure you continue to think about that as you implement your BI team. Engineer for the cloud. There's a lot of options in the cloud. But what you don't want to do is just take your on-premise solution and move it to the cloud. Engineer for the cloud. That's going to take some different thinking. When you think about the fact that you no longer need a database server, you can have a database service. You no longer need a web server, you can have a web service, and no longer worry about the box that is sitting on it. It's going to take a different mentality to be able to bring that to pass, but it's one that's definitely worth the effort, and it's going to save you time in the long run. The other thing is don't leave all the data. Right? Don't leave all the data. You still want to bring some of the data in. Don't leave it all where it's sitting. There are situations where you're still going to have to bring that information into your data warehouse. So don't get in the habit of saying, oh, well, because this system can look into the source system, I don't need to bring anything in. Let's not get into that particular habit because that is going to lead you at another problem on down the line. So let's talk a little bit about the products very quickly. Of course, you've got databases, you've got ETL systems and ELT systems as well. You got streams, your Kinesis streams and such on AWS. You have a ton of OLAP tools, a ton of reporting tools. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with them. There's a ton of them these days. I want you to really consider some of the cloud tools that are out there, right? And once again, there's a ton of them, whether it's from a cloud database perspective using Redshift or whether it's an ETL situation. I mean, there are a ton of cloud tools. Begin to take a look at them. We can't even have a conversation about big data and the future of data warehouses without talking specifically about Hadoop as well. So if you have large data sets, definitely want to take a look at Hadoop and what it can do. Not so much these days, but some people still have this in place, and it's not that it's a bad solution at all, but your database appliances, with the advent of the cloud, you see less of these. However, they're still out there. And those are systems where your software and your hardware kind of couple together from a data warehousing perspective. So, of course, Netezza was purchased by IBM, but the Netezza implementations, when they came out, they said, hey, you don't have to have a huge back-end of Oracle DBAs like you did with Oracle. You don't need all of 10 DBAs to be able to run this system. You may just need a half a DBA. And the system is already optimized for the hardware that it's sitting on. And so it gave you a one-up. Now, once again, with the advent of the cloud, I don't see as many people going the data warehouse appliance. Not that I'm saying it's good or bad. It's just an option that's there. You also want to take a look at different connectors that are able to speed up the process. Ton of them, once again, a ton of them, whether it's just regular connectors to social media or to online third-party cloud services, or even to data services, so that you can just purchase the data service as an API and just bring the data over. You want to look at those connectors to be able to speed up your process. Now, be very careful with that, and I would caution you about not going too overboard and buying a bunch of pre-designed data warehouses. You want to be very, very careful and do your due diligence before you get ready to do anything like that. A couple of pitfalls we want to look at now you can skip the hardware, but you don't want to skip the planning, right? You still plan for the hardware. You still plan for the capacity. You just don't have to go out and purchase it. You can utilize it differently in the cloud. That does not forego your planning, though. Unfortunately, because the cloud allows you to do anything, we see people doing everything. So still do your planning. Still do your due diligence. Now, a tool can be a great vehicle, but it is not the destination. It's the kind of the same thing we tell people about college. We would tell a kid about college. Figure out what you want to do, and then figure out what college can help you get there, what college is the vehicle. And college may not be the vehicle. If you want to be a clown, go to clown school, not Harvard, right? You can spend a bunch of money to make people laugh. So just because the tool is great doesn't mean that it's the end game. Figure out what your end game is. What is your destination? What do you ultimately want to do? And make sure that that tool is a good vehicle to help you get there. A tool can be a phenomenal tool, but not fit your organization or your company just because it doesn't do what you need it to do. Or maybe it does more than you need it to do, right? You can get a lesser tool. Choose the right tool for your organization, right? Don't get caught up in whatever's new and what's hot. Make sure you're choosing the right tool. And the last thing here is don't get stuck in sunk costs. And I talked about that earlier. Just because you have, 40 servers in your data center that run your BI implementation doesn't mean you need 40 servers. Just because you already spent money on them doesn't mean that you have to ride them till the wheels fall off. You've got to be able to make those decisions differently, even if it's saying, hey, look, I know we bought these 2 years ago and they're not due for a refresh until next year, but we can save money if we go ahead and move this information to the cloud or a piece of it to the cloud. And so that way, even though you may not save money that year from a CapEx perspective, you may save money on your refresh a year from then. And that's about making good, smart decisions as an IT professional. So make sure to keep those things in mind. And with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Fivetran.
All right. In fact, let me go ahead and push this other deck here. We got a couple of really good comments in the Q&A. We'll get to those in the round table. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Taylor Brown, co-founder of Fivetran. Tell us what you got.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric, and thanks, Dewayne. Yeah, so you guys, really set the stage here for me, so I really appreciate it. I'm going to just take a few minutes to go through, well, first of all, I'm Taylor, one of the co-founders here at Fivetran. And I just want to walk briefly through a little bit more about the data landscape. I know that Eric and Dewayne have both brought up a bunch of great points so far, and I'm just kind of going to expand on those. And then a little bit about ETL versus the modern data stack. And then a little bit more about, how does Fivetran fit into this whole thing and how does it work? And then we can go into questions from there. So the first thing I want to bring up just about the landscape, again, and I know that this is a point that probably most of you guys already know, but just, how important data is. So, according to McKinsey, companies that are data-driven are 23 more times likely to acquire customers, 6 times more likely to retain customers, and 19 times as likely to be profitable. I'll just let that sit in for a minute, but, basically, it just kind of reaffirms, how critical data is as an asset to companies. That it's not this thing that is just there to help, reinforce the ideas that you have or the gut feelings that you have as a leader at a company, but really to help you inform your decisions, all the way, from the bottom all the way up. So, with that, I like to throw in another cliche, item here that more data was created in 2017 than all the years combined. and it'll be the same for 2018, the same for 2019, and it's just going to continue to grow. And I think that there's kind of two ways that you can look at this. You can look at it as a challenge, or you can look at it as an opportunity. And I think that the companies that can sit there and get over the idea of it as a challenge and really think of it more as an opportunity and not as something that's daunting are the ones that are really going to excel and going to compete, in their own, independent markets. So from there, just diving into what did the, BI stack somewhat look like even 5-10 years ago. The way we like to describe it is really this classic ETL paradigm, and both Dewayne and Eric have, kind of touched on these, but I want to go into some of the more specific details of this. And so what the classic ETL paradigm was this idea where you extract the data from the source systems, you transform that data and often pre-aggregate it, then you load it into a database. A lot of times these databases were row store databases, more built as transactional databases, not necessarily for the purposes of data warehousing. And then you visualize by shipping the results to a desktop BI tool. And some of the largest challenges of this are there was this particular stack forced a lot of extensive planning. So you have to sit down and really in a waterfall type fashion. You'd have to, try and think through all the questions you want to think of ask your data ahead of time, which is just really, really difficult to do. And these, there were long development cycles. So any sort of changes that you need to make, you have to go back through, and they could take weeks or months to make even small changes. And so there's also extensive setup. So you're connecting to all these different sources. I think a lot of the sources that were available in the 90s and early 2000s were also, customized or, on-premise systems that were either custom APIs or you had to, pull through FTP or things like that. So there was just a whole lot of extensive setup. And then there's last is just ongoing maintenance. And this is the thing that really, I think, gets a lot of teams is just these systems are continually things that you have to maintain and manage. And so as we, just kind of digging into a little bit more about, why each of these, why this, companies would select to use this sort of classic ETL stack, I think part of it, as I mentioned, is just because there's a lot of custom, on-premise applications, FTP file stores, disparate files that were needed to be pulled in. And so a lot of times you needed a system that was pretty customizable. There's no off-the-shelf solution for just grabbing these things. And then I think, in terms of pre-transforming this data, a big reason to optimize it for this was just that the cost of data storage was super high. And so companies were having to pre-aggregate this data. And then additionally, the databases were also not that powerful. So again, these are row store databases. And so in order to get, fast queries out of them, you'd have to have a fair amount of deviated management where you are not running the queries, real time. You're essentially running them in batch jobs in off hours. So, 2, 3, 4 a.m. in the morning and running, them at that point and having reports, basically on a one-day lag. And then you're having to do a lot of query optimizing around that. And then finally, the visualization where you were having to do full replication of the specific reports or data that you wanted for your desktop BI tools. So this was, this setup was, again, really kind of dictated by the technology. So this was somewhat of the best that companies could do. And what I think most companies in the 90s and 2000s, early 2000s were just looking for reporting that was accurate. And this system definitely got you to a very accurate set of reports. I think that the biggest challenge just was just really not that agile. So the other big thing here is that it was as Dewayne talked about, like who's this for and who's managing it, and really looking at the human capital side of these processes. I think this classic ETL paradigm was very much managed by IT, which is I think it kind of had to be because the systems were so complex. There was so much technology involved in it. But, there's the big challenge with that is kind of, proven here by Gartner, is that between 70 and 80% of corporate business intelligence projects fail. And it's failure from IT to ask the right questions or to think about the real needs of the business means that these projects fail. And this is, nothing against the IT departments. I think it's just that this is a very hard thing for the communication to be clear across all these different teams. So in this classic ETL paradigm, you'd have, you'd have a product management team, you'd have an analyst team, you'd have the end users, you'd have the engineering team, and then you'd have, IT, which is somehow kind of involved in all of that. And so each individual team had an understanding of one, compartmentalized piece of that entire ETL stack, but none of them had a great understanding of the entire thing. So there's just a lot of communication fall down. I think, there's a lot of times where the analysts were expecting, data to be transformed or aggregated in a certain way, and then the engineering or IT department would do it a slightly different way, and you can end up with quite different results. So I think that's kind of why this whole paradigm starts, really just is hard to succeed with. So that was the time of the old, and what's, I think what the big thing now is just like what's changed. And, as Eric went into, there's now just, thousands of new applications, and today's companies are leveraging a plethora of these cloud-based tools. So web applications, like Salesforce, for instance, web databases, or files and events. I think that the big thing that a lot of companies are looking to is just using more standardized web-based tools that they can set up quickly, that they don't have to, essentially run the infrastructure for. That's the first big change. The second big change is that data storage is practically free. So if you look at, I love this chart, but if you look at, 1966, 1 gigabyte of data cost roughly $1 million. And today in 2017, 1 gigabyte data costs about 2 cents. So there's just been a huge drop in storage, and I imagine that this will continue to grow. So that's the other big change that's forced or has allowed companies to change the way that they approach their data stack. And then the last one here is just column store cloud data warehouses like Snowflake or Redshift, BigQuery, Azure SQL Data Warehouse, where these are column stores. They're designed to be and optimized to be extremely fast for analytical workloads. And a lot of them, Snowflake and BigQuery, separate compute and store, which, is extremely powerful and allows you to have multiple different teams running off of a single data set without, having to deal with workload overlap and things like that. And then there's zero infrastructure management, which I think is another thing, just, simplifying what you're managing is a big way of ensuring success. And then, a lot of these work with structured and unstructured data. And then the other thing is instantly scalable compute. So you can, turn up or turn down the compute as much as you need on most of these systems, which is just another huge advantage. And then, the last, kind of going back to the IT thing, I think, if you look 1980s, most of analytics was driven by IT. 2000s was still majority IT. 2010s or early 2000s, like business users depended on IT for setup and maintenance, but the analysts had a strong hold on it. And I think today the big thing is that analysts really want to have the power and agility to go in and work with this data and not have to continually go back and forth and play this game of telephone with the IT department, the engineering department, some sort of product management department, but rather just interface directly with the end user teams. So that's a big shift, and I think that's what companies have recognized with being agile. You have to have these quick iteration cycles, and so the less groups you have involved, the more likely the easier it is to have an agile setup. So what does the modern data stack look like then? As we see it, we move from the ETL to, as we call it, the modern data stack, or you could say like an ELT stack, where you essentially extract the data, load it into the warehouse in a more holistic way, and then you run your transformation layer directly against the warehouse and the the speed of the columnar warehouse there. And then you visualize by only shipping the results to a browser-based BI tool that would be running queries directly against your warehouse. And so some of the pros to this are that you get a full schema replication. So think data lake here, and with a tool, say for instance like Snowflake, where their underlying data store is S3, you can scale it up as large or as small as you want. And so it can continue to scale all the way up, and you're not going to run into issues where you're overloading the database in any particular way. The other thing is that with this sort of setup, a lot of times you can get standardized schemas. So the APIs, for instance, mostly have standard schemas, and so you can have a pretty standardized setup that in terms of the schemas that you're getting. And then SQL-based modeling and transformation. This is a huge one, and it plays really hand in hand with the standardized schemas. One thing, and I'll get into this later on, but Fivetran really focuses on trying to deliver somewhat pre-transformed normalized schemas. So then the actual amount of transformation that you're doing in the database transformation layer is a lot less cumbersome than, say, a transformation layer that you'd be doing if you were pre-aggregating it prior to loading into a database. The other big things about it being SQL-based is that SQL is a standard, and so SQL's been optimized and designed for doing this over the last 35 years. And so it's something that everyone typically knows and that is very standard and easy for anyone to jump into, versus if you have to use a tool like, say, Informatica, or a highly customized code base. It's really hard to add new users because you've got to train those particular users, and anything you're doing is going to be somewhat customized. And so there's knowledge is going to reside with the individuals that are actually building that system, which can maybe is good from like a job security perspective, but from a company perspective, it can be definitely scary. And then finally, the visualization layer is centralized and collaborative because it's web-based, and it's really designed more about sharing and about iteration and giving direct access to all of your users. And then I like to kind of point this out, but for a typical Fortune 1000 company, just a 10% increase in data accessibility will result in more than 65 million additional net income. So this is just kind of pointing out that if you are successful at getting the data into your users' hands and allowing them to actually build this into their daily workflows and actually leverage data for their decision making and for how they're handling their job, there's a massive increase in your net income overall as a company. And I think this is just a really great point here. So how does Fivetran fit into the whole thing? Fivetran helps you achieve data accessibility with zero configuration, zero maintenance data pipelines. And so we are a data pipeline as a service. We connect to applications, databases, files, and events, and we load that data directly into your warehouse. We offer a number of different warehouses that we support. And then in terms of the source systems, we support a ton of different applications, everything from Salesforce and Marketo and Mixpanel and NetSuite. And I think we're continually adding new ones. So we had about 2 to 3 a month right now, and that will continue to increase. We support a lot of the key databases like Oracle, MySQL, SQL Server, Postgres, and files we can connect to S3, Blob Storage, FTP, FTPS, SFTP, and then events. We do have some event collection libraries for like sending webhooks or various streaming events to us as well. And I think of this more as a toolkit for analysts, where an analyst comes in and says, okay, great, my job is to build a reporting layer that we can give out to our various different groups, and I need to get data from XYZ source. They can just come in and they can set it up very quickly and pull it in from whether it's an FTP or whether it's a database or whether it's an API very easily. So how does it exactly work? Basically, you come in, you connect your source, you connect your warehouse, and then you connect your source. Oftentimes, with one click, you can authenticate it. So say you connect to something like Salesforce, you authenticate it. We would then go in, pull all the historical data, normalize that data, create schemas, tables, and load that data into the warehouse, and then we continue to update it every 5 minutes, say. And that's literally within about like a 5 to 3 minute setup within our system. And then in terms of how the data gets normalized is a big one that people ask about. And I'm going to try and get through this in the next 3 minutes here so we can get to questions in the last 10 minutes. But for normalized data, for denormalized data, we heavily normalize it. So if the source data is an API, we'll look at that data, we will normalize it and put it into a schema that makes the most sense in the warehouse for our users to start working with. And then from already normalized schemas, we just replicate that data directly, which, so that you get an exact replica so that your analysts can not have to rely on IT or rely on anyone to help get the data out of these systems. It's just there and in a schema for them to start working with. And for the standard schemas, we do have ERDs, so you know exactly what you're going to get. And then we do, perform incremental batch updates. So this is a big one, and this is by default when, something changes in the source. Say you insert records, we will insert records automatically in the warehouse. If you update records in the source, we'll update them in the warehouse. If you delete records in the source, we typically don't delete them. We'll mark them as deleted. So we essentially keep an archive of all the data that you have. And we have a number of customers who use this to purge their source systems so their source systems are not, overloaded with a ton of extra data, but that yet they still retain copies of this in their cheaper warehouse that they can store a lot more data in. And then in terms of schema migrations, we do schema migrations automatically. So if you add a column, we'll add a column. If you remove a column, we don't remove them, but we'll give you an alert on that. If you change data type, we will actually drop that column and recreate it with the same value, the same name, but a new data type. Typically, this is for like a widening change. If you add an object, we add an object. If you remove an object, we don't remove an object. And then finally, obviously, very serious about security. The big question is like, is this okay to pass to the cloud? And everything does pass through our cloud. And the big thing for us is, we do have SOC 2 compliance, HIPAA compliance, we're GDPR compliant. We're encrypted end to end. And a big one, I think, is that there's no data retention within our system. So the data gets passed through, it gets loaded into the system automatically, and then everything gets removed from our system. So those are the kind of key things about Fivetran. One final thing I want to leave you guys with, kind of final thought here, is just complexity compounds. And I think what I mean by that is that anything that you're building, any system that you have to create, whether it's from a management perspective, like the teams, like the fact that if you have to have 7 different teams, discuss and work through having, a single pipeline built or a single stack built, there's a lot of complexity in that communication versus if you only have 2, a lot less communication needs to happen. And, if you end up building a really complex system, then you have to teach your users about that complexity. And typically you're going to have the other, systems that integrate with that be complex as well. So I think that's the one thing to really think about is like if you can design systems as simply as possible from the beginning, and if you automate, standardize, and simplify as much of your stack as you can, then you really set yourself up for success. So that's all I've got. We've got Q&A. So Eric, I'll hand this back over to you to get going on that.
You bet. We do have a bunch of really good questions, folks. Don't be shy. Send them in using the Q&A or the chat window. So I'll start last one first here. It's a pretty good one. One attendee is asking, in the modern BI stack, how does one achieve conformity if the transform is done for individual business requirements? Are we not creating more silos? You already kind of talked about that a little bit, but could you dive in and explain how you solve that?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I think that the idea there is that you have one transformation layer within the warehouse that everyone builds on top of. So this becomes a data governance layer, essentially. And this is where you decide and you build out your your dimensional tables there, and then you plug your BI on top of that. And depending on, you could have multiple different BI tools, you could have multiple different groups all pointed to that same central transformation layer, but you're going to end up with a single version of the same truth. So in my, I guess in my eye, I don't see that as siloed at all.
Okay, good. And I want to throw this slide up here again because it really speaks to how much you've already built. And I'm curious to know, how much time and effort do you have to spend paying attention to API changes in all these different services? Because they will change at their own schedule. I'm guessing that's a fairly big part of what you do.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think one thing, I didn't really touch on this all that much, is that it is a completely managed service, and we are sitting there watching all of these changes. So there are constantly API changes, and that's a big part of our job, is that we're sitting there, we are noticing these changes, we're moving to the new versions, and we're trying to make them all backwards compatible so that for you as the user, you sit there and your schemas don't change, your analytics are not affected. In fact, you don't even have to know about it. It just all happens under the hood for you.
Yeah, here's a good comment by an attendee who says, as a programmer for many years, I'm a fan of Informatica, .NET, Oracle, et cetera. The main reason is they are feature-rich. From his perspective, he's saying his current experience on Redshift is it's feature-poor. I mean, obviously, the newer vendors in the space are kind of rolling out functionality as time goes by. Well, what's your thought on the difference between some of those standard environments that are rather feature-rich and some of these new guys? What's the disparity from your perspective?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think part of it comes down to identifying exactly what you're trying to do in each of these. Like, Informatica has a tremendous number of features that you can build, but it also is a system that's extremely complex, and it enforces a tremendous amount of management. So when you build something, you have to sit there and maintain it, i.e., if you say you're pulling 30,000 tables from a source system and loading them into a warehouse, anytime that a column changes or a new table is created, you have to go back and recreate that same or fix that setup, right? And so you have to, I think, also look at it from a perspective of, yes, they're highly customizable and they do have everything under the sun, but like, you're going to end up managing that whole process. And so I think you have to really look at the opportunity cost there. And for us, our philosophy is, I think we work for this workflow for about 80 to 85% of customers that come in. We do have a dogmatic perspective on it, but if you can, buy into that dogmatic perspective and you can get it into, a cloud warehouse and you can do things that way, typically you can get just about everything done that way. I think that the things that Redshift and the warehouses are lacking, I think that they're going to continue to build out, and there are additional tools that are being built around that. So part of the idea is to build, compartmentalized tools that fit into the stack here where you need them. So like Fivetran takes the data, loads it into the warehouse, and then if you need to build a really complicated transformation layer that maybe SQL doesn't support, or you want to do some sort of like R modeling, or you want to bring in Python or things like that, then you can bring in a transformation layer in like Airflow or DBT, if you're familiar with that, that sits right on top of that you can do some of that more complex modeling with.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And, I love this concept of data pipelines. In fact, our synthesis series is going to focus next on what we call modern data pipelines. And I think it's just fascinating if you look at the different components of a data warehouse solution. Of course, you have the data, you have ingest, you have the modeling layers, you have the analytical layers, et cetera. All these different components all sort of weave together to create the whole. And it seems to me what we've seen over the past really 5 years is tremendous innovation. Of course, number one in the cloud with Snowflake, for example, which has done really amazing things in terms of being able to spin up data warehouses very, very quickly. So you've collapsed the cycle time from months down to, even hours in some cases. And then also on the ingest sides, right? So that's where Fivetran has really made a lot of waves, it seems to me. And I guess the question I'll throw at you is, I think it's fascinating the way these components are all sort of weaving together, because it's not as if one vendor came along and boiled the ocean. We actually have a whole complement of vendors that are innovating in the different component parts, and that can get woven together by the end user, by the company, by the client. What do you think about that, Taylor?
Yeah, I definitely think that we've moved away from this like monolithic end-to-end BI stack to a much more compartmentalized, much more well-integrated and partner-structured environment, in which case you have companies like Fivetran, which, integrate, and connect perfectly with any of the warehouses you want to load into, and then you have tools like, Looker or Tableau or Periscope or, that will just sit right directly on top of the warehouse and that you can plug in. And I think the thing that you get with a bunch of small or, compartmentalized tools that you don't get with a monolithic setup is you get a bunch of people, companies that are heavily focused on each individual part. So you have these, best-in-class tools that all link up very, very seamlessly, and that are amazing versus like one big monolithic tool that does maybe one or two things in the stack well.
Yep, no, that's a good point. And we've got another question that just streamed in from an attendee. If you do not retain the data, expired daily, as you said, then you cannot save history if not available from the source. Can you talk about data lineage and historical context and so forth with this solution model?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, our philosophy on this, there's definitely, if you're trying to do slowly change dimensions or things like that, like history of the data is very important. We do for, a lot of the data sources from APIs, it's hard for us to capture data because like, we make a call to the API and, say something has changed, 3 times before the next time we call the API, we're only getting the delta. So we're not seeing every version of, whatever that change has been versus the databases we read off of the logs. And so we do actually capture every version of every change. Right now, we do not push all this history into the warehouse. We're just doing updates, but we do have a plan to actually produce history tables on all of the data that we're syncing into the warehouse so that customers can then really build their own snapshots from that data. And that will still not require us to retain any data within our own system.
Okay, good. And, we kind of touched on governance at various points during the webinar today. GDPR, of course, is effective now. I'm sure everyone got about 17 emails in their inbox last Friday about privacy policy updates from every company under the sun. But attendee is asking about GDPR and if that complicates things from your perspective. I'm guessing that it doesn't really complicate things, but what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, we are still trying to, figure out exactly how the market is going to handle this. I think there are a lot of gray areas right now. We're seeing a plethora of different strategies from each of our customers. Some customers are deciding that they don't want to load any of this personal data from the source into the warehouse. So they're either trying to anonymize it or just, not load any of this personalized data so that if an end user of that customer decides that they want PII or their own data removed from that particular vendor, that they can just remove it in the source and not have to deal with it in the warehouse. That's kind of one way that a lot of customers are handling it. For us, the other way is just, customers will load into the warehouse and then they can go and remove it from there. Since Fivetran does not retain any of this data, we're just passing it through. So I think it's a fairly universal way that most customers can decide how they want to handle this. And so, we don't necessarily have a strong take on that at this point, but really just waiting to see what the market kind of dictates.
Sure thing. And I love this slide, by the way, that you threw in here because it just kind of speaks to the value that you get. In fact, I tweeted from one of my accounts, anyone want an additional $65 million? Well, what company doesn't want that, right? I mean, it just kind of, it reminds us that there's a purpose to all of this, and the purpose is to improve the business, to find new opportunities, to improve revenue, et cetera. And if you are truly data-driven and you're truly agile, then you're going to be able to do that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, one last question for you as we clock to the top of the hour. One attendee asked us about streaming data. Is that something you guys are tackling at the moment, or are you working on that?
We do have endpoints to send streaming data directly to Fivetran. I think that there are a lot of times customers will just take that streaming data and load it either into an S3 environment, or a storage environment, and then Fivetran will grab it from there. We are inherently a batch system, and that's, kind of somewhat dictated by the warehouse load times. a lot of these columnar warehouses are not designed for, streaming data loads. So we will batch it. But yes, we can absolutely handle the workload for sure.
All right, folks, we burned through an hour and change here. Very big thanks to our friends from Fivetran, Taylor Brown and Company. I'm just fascinated by this. It's another wonderful innovation in the management of data and the use of data and really expediting the time to value and collapsing those cycle times. Very good stuff. Feel free to reach out directly to Taylor. There's some information for him. And big thanks to our buddy Dewayne Washington of Eckerson Group, the BI Pharaoh. We do archive all these webinars for later viewing, so don't be shy. Feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. The archive should be up fairly shortly. It usually comes in about an hour or two, so be sure to update that. And send us any questions you have. info@insightanalysis.com. Come straight to me. Send me any thoughts you have. And with that, we'll bid you farewell, folks. Thanks again. Catch up with you next time. Take care. Bye-bye. All right, and Taylor, feel free to sit around for a minute if you want.
Okay.